It was just after midnight, and the lone gas station on Old Mill Road sat silent, its fluorescent lights flickering slightly in the darkness. Kyle was pulling the graveyard shift, the quiet one with little to no customers. Usually he'd sit back, sip his coffee, and wait out the hours until dawn, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with an odd tension, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Around 1 a.m., an old, beat-up sedan pulled in, its headlights barely illuminating the cracked asphalt. Kyle watched as the driver, an unkempt man in his late 50s with wild, darting eyes, stumbled out of the car. He filled up his tank without saying a word, his gaze fixated on the dark woods that loomed beyond the edge of the lot. Kyle noticed the man's hands were shaking as he gripped the gas pump. As the man finished filling his tank, he rushed to the door, burst in, and looked around frantically, as if he were searching for something or running from it. "You all right, man?" Kyle asked, trying to sound calm. The man's head jerked toward him, eyes wide with panic. You seen anyone around here?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Nope, just you," Kyle replied, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. "Why?" The man shook his head, muttering something under his breath. They follow you. In the dark. I was just up the road near the state line. Saw a woman in the road, dressed in white. Couldn't see her face. Just white." His eyes glazed over, and he trembled. I didn't stop. And she's here." Kyle chuckled nervously, thinking it was some kind of weird prank. But before he could respond, the man's face drained of color, and he pointed out the window. "She's here," he said, barely above a whisper. Kyle turned to look, and his heart skipped. Standing on the edge of the parking lot was a woman, pale and motionless, dressed in a flowing white dress that seemed almost translucent in the fluorescent light. Her face was shadowed, her hair hanging in long, dark strands that obscured her features. She stood perfectly still, her hands hanging limply at her sides as if she were waiting. Kyle blinked, and she was gone. "Did you see that?" Kyle asked, but when he turned back, the man was gone too, his car still idling in the lot. He hadn't heard the door chime, hadn't seen him leave. The station was dead silent again. Heart pounding, Kyle stepped outside, looking around, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. The car sat abandoned, its headlights casting long shadows across the lot. Just as he took a step back, he heard a whisper behind him, a soft, raspy sound that sent a chill down his spine. He spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to shift, though, growing darker, as if something unseen was creeping closer. His heart raced as he hurried back into the store, locking the door behind him. He reached for the phone, intending to call the police, but the line was dead. A low, static hum crackled through the store's speakers, growing louder until it filled the air, oppressive and thick. And then he saw her again, reflected in the glass door. She was standing right behind him. Kyle felt a cold, skeletal hand graze his shoulder. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The lights flickered, plunging the station into darkness. His heart raced as he stumbled backward, desperate to get away, but she was everywhere now, reflected in the windows, standing in the aisles, her face still hidden, her figure a shifting, shadowy blur. He backed up until he hit the counter, his breath shallow, his body frozen with fear. Her face was just inches from his now, obscured by the darkness, but he could feel her cold breath on his skin, smell the faint, musty odor of earth and decay. "Kyle," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo. He felt his blood run cold as he realized she knew his name. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the parking lot, slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer. Each step felt like a countdown, a ticking clock marking the seconds until something. The power surged back, and the lights flickered on. Kyle looked around, heart pounding, but she was gone. The store was empty, eerily silent, as if nothing had happened. He let out a shaky breath, thinking it was over, that he'd somehow escaped. But then, he noticed the old sedan was gone, the spot where it had been parked now empty. In its place, scrawled across the asphalt in dark, smeared letters, were the words, "See you soon." He staggered back, feeling a rush of panic. He raced to lock up the station and ran to his car, desperate to leave, but as he reached his vehicle, he froze. In his rearview mirror, he saw her face, a pale, hollow face with dark, empty eyes staring back at him from the back seat. As he screamed, the lights of the station flickered once more, and then everything went dark. The last thing anyone saw of Kyle was his car, idling in the parking lot until morning, the driver's seat empty, his keys still in the ignition. No one ever found Kyle, but some say that on quiet nights, if you drive past the old gas station on Old Mill Road, you might catch a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror, his terrified eyes staring back, warning you to turn around. The midnight fog was thick, blanketing the deserted highway as Jim drove alone on his way back from a late shift. He was tired, and his gas gauge was dangerously low, so when he saw the dimly lit sign for a gas station just up ahead, he felt a wave of relief. Pulling into the station, he noticed it was strangely isolated, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to close in, pressing against the tiny circle of light around the pumps. As he stepped out of his car, he noticed that the place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The paint was peeling, the sign above the pump was flickering, and the windows of the small convenience store were covered in a thin layer of grime. There was no attendant in sight, just an old sign swinging gently from the door that read, "Closed." But the pump was on, and that was all Jim cared about. He inserted his card and waited, watching as the numbers slowly ticked upward. The silence was absolute, almost suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent light above. Then he heard it, a low, whispering sound coming from somewhere in the woods. It was faint, barely more than a murmur, but it carried through the stillness of the night, sending a chill down his spine. Jim paused, straining his ears to make out the words, but he couldn't. The whispers seemed to grow louder, closer, wrapping around him like invisible tendrils. As he turned back to his car, a strange sensation washed over him, the feeling of being watched. His eyes darted around, scanning the dark trees, the empty road, and the shadows cast by the flickering lights. Then he saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim light. She was dressed in a simple white dress, her skin pale and ghostly. Her head was tilted to one side, her long dark hair covering most of her face. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, watching him. Jim's heart pounded as he stared back, frozen in place. There was something deeply unsettling about her presence, something wrong. He tried to convince himself that she was just a hitchhiker, maybe lost, maybe in need of help. But as he took a step forward, the lights flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, she vanished. He stood there, heart racing, eyes darting around the lot. She couldn't have just disappeared. She had to be there, hiding somewhere in the shadows, watching him. Trying to shake off his nerves, he finished filling up his tank and got back into his car, locking the doors as he sat down. As he started the engine, he glanced in his rearview mirror and froze. She was sitting in the back seat, her face inches from his, her empty, hollow eyes staring into his. Her mouth was open, her jaw hanging unnaturally low, and a low, rattling breath echoed in the silence. Before he could scream, she whispered, her voice cold and distant, "Take me home." His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, paralyzed by fear. Her voice was like ice crawling down his spine. He tried to muster the courage to look back, to confront whatever she was, but his body wouldn't respond. All he could do was watch her reflection in the mirror, her hollow eyes locking onto his, her face inches from his own. "I don't know where your home is," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. She didn't respond. Instead, she raised one skeletal finger and pointed at the dark road ahead. Jim's hands shook as he shifted the car into drive, his eyes fixed on the road. He drove, his entire body tense, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He wanted to scream, to pull over and run, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Every time he glanced in the mirror, she was there closer than before, her empty eyes watching him, her mouth slightly open, as if ready to speak. The road stretched endlessly, a winding path through dense woods that seemed to press in on either side. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the engine and his own ragged breathing. He didn't know how long he'd been driving, didn't know where he was. The gas gauge was dipping lower and lower, but he couldn't stop, couldn't turn back. He was trapped, bound to drive on this endless, lonely road with her in the back seat. Then, as the first hint of dawn broke over the horizon, she finally spoke. "Here," she whispered, her voice like wind through dry leaves. Her hand extended, pointing to a narrow dirt road that veered off into the woods. With trembling hands, Jim turned down the road, his headlights casting long shadows that danced along the trees. He drove for what felt like hours, the sky growing lighter, the trees growing thicker, until he reached an old, abandoned house. The house was decrepit, its windows shattered, its walls covered in creeping vines. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the entire place radiated an aura of despair and decay. "Go inside," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jim's body moved on its own as he opened the car door and stepped out, drawn toward the house by some invisible force. He approached the door, his footsteps echoing on the rotting wood, the air thick with the stench of mold and damp earth. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him and he was plunged into darkness. He reached out, feeling his way along the walls, his heart pounding. Then he heard her voice again, closer this time, right next to his ear. "You're home now." The last thing Jim felt was a cold, skeletal hand wrapping around his wrist, pulling him deeper into the shadows, into a darkness that swallowed him whole. When the sun rose fully, the old house stood silent once more, empty and abandoned, with no sign of Jim or the woman. They say if you drive down that road at night past the old gas station, you might hear faint whispers from the woods. Some say if you stop, you'll see a pale woman in white, watching from the shadows, waiting for someone to take her home. And if you're unlucky enough to meet her gaze, she just might climb into your back seat, ready for another long, endless ride through the darkness. It was supposed to be a quick stop. Carly had been driving all night, trying to make it to her friend's wedding in the next town over, and she was exhausted. Her gas light had been on for miles, so when she spotted an old gas station just off the main highway, she pulled in, relieved to see it was open. The station looked like something out of a horror movie. Rusted pumps, broken lights flickering, and a dilapidated sign hanging from a single chain. The only hint of life was a dim light in the convenience store window. She got out, shivering as a cold breeze cut through the warm night air. As she filled her tank, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She was completely alone, surrounded by a vast field of darkness, with no cars, no sounds but the faint hum of the pump. A shadow in the corner of her eye caught her attention, and she glanced toward the store. Through the grimy glass, she saw a figure standing behind the counter. It was a man, barely visible in the dim light, wearing a uniform and staring straight at her. But his face was wrong. His features were distorted, his skin pale and gray, his mouth frozen in a twisted grin that seemed far too wide. Carly's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, and he was gone. Shaking off the creeping unease, she finished pumping her gas and walked toward the store to pay. As she opened the door, a little bell jingled, echoing in the emptiness. The inside was dark, the shelves covered in dust, rows of expired snacks lined up like artifacts from another era. There was no one at the counter. The air smelled stale, like something rotting. She cleared her throat, hoping someone would appear. "Hello?" Her voice seemed to disappear in the silence. No response. Just as she was about to leave, a hand reached out and grabbed her wrist. She gasped, spinning around to see the attendant, the man she'd seen through the window. Up close, he looked even worse, his skin gray and lifeless, his eyes sunken and clouded. His twisted smile hadn't changed, stretching far too wide across his face. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice dry and cracked like dead leaves rustling in the wind. His grip was cold, painfully tight. Carly pulled her arm away, heart pounding. "I just needed gas. I'll pay and go," she stammered. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there, smiling, staring at her with those hollow eyes. "She's here, you know. She's always here," he whispered, almost to himself. Then he pointed toward the back of the store, his hand trembling slightly. Carly followed his gaze and saw a door, partially open, leading to a back room. Every instinct screamed for her to leave, but something drew her forward, some strange pull that she couldn't resist. She took a step toward the door, then another, her breath shallow as she reached out to push it open. The room was dark, lit only by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. She could barely make out the shapes of old boxes and shelves piled high with forgotten supplies. But then she saw her. A woman stood in the corner, her back to Carly, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, her hair long and tangled, spilling down her shoulders like shadows. She was humming softly, an eerie, lilting tune that filled the room with a chilling sense of dread. "Ma'am?" Carly whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't know why she'd spoken, didn't even know why she was still standing there. She just felt compelled. The woman stopped humming, her head tilting slightly as if she'd heard Carly. She remained silent, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, she turned. Her face was a nightmare. Eyes sunken and dark, skin paper thin and stretched tight across her skull, lips cracked and twisted into a grotesque smile. But it was her eyes that sent a chill down Carly's spine. They were empty, black pits, hollow and lifeless, staring straight at her with an intensity that seemed to pierce her soul. Carly tried to scream, but no sound came out. She stumbled back, her heart pounding as the woman took a step toward her, then another, her movements jerky or mechanical. The humming started again, louder this time, filling Carly's mind, drowning out her thoughts. The door behind her slammed shut, and she was trapped, alone in the darkness with the woman. The last thing Carly saw was that twisted smile, those empty, hollow eyes, as the woman reached out, her fingers cold and bony wrapping around her throat. The humming grew louder, filling her ears, suffocating her as the world faded into darkness. The next morning, her car was found idling outside the gas station, empty. The station itself was silent, abandoned, as if no one had been there in years. The police searched, but there was no trace of Carly, no sign she'd ever been there at all. But sometimes, on quiet nights, drivers passing the old gas station claim they hear faint humming drifting through the air. Some say if you stop and listen closely, you'll see a figure standing in the window, a woman with empty eyes and a twisted smile, waiting for her next visitor. And if you're unlucky enough to meet her gaze, you might just find yourself drawn in, unable to leave. The rain was coming down hard when Dave pulled into the small, decrepit gas station in the middle of nowhere. It was the only thing for miles, a flickering beacon in an otherwise pitch-black night. The station's single, barely functional pump sat under a flimsy metal awning that creaked with every gust of wind. The whole place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. Dave sighed, glancing at his gas gauge. He'd been driving for hours and couldn't afford to be picky. He needed gas, and he needed it now. He pulled up to the pump and got out, immediately drenched by the rain that blew in under the awning. As he reached for the pump, he glanced toward the small convenience store. The lights inside were dim, casting eerie shadows across the shelves. Through the rain-streaked glass, he thought he saw a figure moving behind the counter, but he couldn't make out any details. Ignoring the unease creeping up his spine, he started pumping his gas. The silence of the deserted station was only broken by the hiss of rain and the low hum of the pump. He tried to focus on that, tried to ignore the feeling that he was being watched. Then he heard it. A faint scraping sound, like nails dragging along a chalkboard. He turned his head, looking toward the store again, but saw nothing. The lights inside seemed to flicker, casting strange, shifting shadows. He shook his head, telling himself it was just the rain playing tricks on his eyes. As he was about to turn away, the scraping sound came again, louder this time, echoing from inside the store. He took a hesitant step forward, peering through the glass. The shelves were empty, rows of dusty snacks and abandoned soda bottles littering the floor, but there was no sign of the figure he'd seen earlier. He was about to head back to his car when a loud bang echoed from the back of the store, followed by what sounded like shuffling footsteps. His heart pounded, and against his better judgment, he found himself edging closer to the entrance. "Hello?" he called, his voice swallowed by the rain. No response. Just as he was about to turn back, the door to the store creaked open, swinging inward as if beckoning him inside. He froze, torn between fear and curiosity, but something compelled him forward, as if he were no longer in control of his own feet. The store was colder than it had any right to be, a damp, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into his skin. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of mildew, rot, and something metallic like old blood. He took a few steps inside, squinting in the dim light. The shelves were empty, dust and grime covering everything. But there, behind the counter, was a figure. A man, hunched over, his back turned to Dave. The man's clothes were tattered, his hair wild and matted. His hands, though visible above the counter, were gray and mottled, the nails long and cracked. Hey? Are you okay?" Dave asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. He just stood there, his back still turned, his shoulders hunched as if he were in pain. Dave took a hesitant step closer. The figure straightened, and slowly, with an unnatural, jerking motion, he began to turn around. Dave's breath caught in his throat as he saw the man's face, or rather, what was left of it. The skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull, his eyes hollow and sunken, filled with a dark, unnatural void. His mouth was twisted into a ghastly grin, exposing broken, yellowed teeth. Blood dripped from the corners of his lips, staining his shirt. The man's eyes fixed on Dave, a chilling, predatory stare that froze him in place. "You shouldn't be here," the man rasped, his voice a guttural growl, like nails scraping against concrete. Dave stumbled backward, his heart pounding. I just needed gas," he stammered, his voice shaking. The man's grin widened, stretching impossibly, his eyes gleaming with a dark hunger. "You'll stay." They all stay. The lights flickered, plunging the store into darkness for a moment. When they came back on, the man was gone, but Dave could still feel those empty eyes watching him, feel that twisted grin lingering in the air. Panicking, he turned to run, but as he reached the door, it slammed shut in front of him, locking him inside. He pulled at the handle, banging on the glass, but it wouldn't budge. Then he heard the scraping sound again, this time closer, coming from the aisles. He looked over his shoulder and saw shadowy figures moving between the shelves, their shapes flickering in and out of sight, their footsteps growing louder. "Let me out!" he screamed, pounding on the door, but his voice seemed to vanish in the empty, echoing silence. The shadows grew closer, surrounding him, their eyes hollow and dark, their twisted smiles reflecting the same unnatural hunger as the man behind the counter. They moved in unison, reaching out with skeletal hands that seemed to stretch, their fingers impossibly long and clawed, closing in on him. He backed against the door, his heart racing, as they circled him, whispering words he couldn't understand, voices overlapping in a chorus of dark, guttural sounds. He felt cold hands grip his shoulders, pulling him down, their touch like ice, sapping the warmth from his body. His vision began to blur as the shadows enveloped him, their voices a hypnotic chant that echoed through his mind. He felt his strength draining, his body growing heavy, his vision fading as the darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, the gas station sat silent and empty, the door slightly ajar, the rain washing away the faint traces of footprints leading into the woods. They say if you drive by that station on a rainy night, you can still see a shadowy figure standing inside, his face twisted in a perpetual grin, watching the road, waiting for the next unlucky traveler who might stop. It was late at night when Sarah pulled off the highway, desperate for gas and caffeine to keep herself awake for the long drive ahead. The station she found was barely lit, with one rusty pump under a single flickering light. There was no other car in sight. No sign of anyone in the small, grimy shop attached to the station, but she was exhausted and had no other options. As she got out to pump her gas, she noticed a shadow shift inside the store. She squinted through the dirty glass and saw a man standing behind the counter, just barely visible in the dim light. His figure was mostly obscured, but she could see his face, or at least the lower half of it. He wore an odd grin, one that seemed to grow wider as she watched. She quickly looked away, unsettled. She'd dealt with strange gas stations before, and as long as she could fill her tank, she'd be on her way soon enough. The pump was old and slow, so while she waited, she glanced back at the shop. The man behind the counter was gone. The sudden absence was more unsettling than his presence. She shifted uneasily, telling herself it was nothing, just a clerk moving around in the back. The pump clicked, indicating her tank was full. She put the nozzle back, glancing at the store again. No one. But she felt it, that inexplicable feeling of being watched. Her skin prickled as she realized the door to the store was slightly open, swinging in the faint breeze. Sarah hesitated, then pulled out her wallet, feeling a sense of duty to pay. She didn't want to get charged for skipping out, but every instinct screamed at her to leave. Still, she convinced herself to step inside. She approached the counter, but the store was eerily silent, the air heavy and stale. She couldn't see anyone behind the counter. "Hello?" she called, her voice muffled by the silence. There was no response. The store was cramped, shelves piled with dusty cans and faded snack wrappers. She heard a faint rustling sound and glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see someone there, but it was empty. Every nerve in her body felt taut, as if someone or something was waiting just out of sight. A sudden tapping sound echoed through the store, sharp and rhythmic. She froze, the sound coming from the back, near a door marked Employees Only. The tap, tap, tap was steady, as if someone were knocking from the other side. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice shaky. She felt ridiculous, but the silence pressed down on her, thick and stifling. The tapping stopped. She held her breath, listening intently. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the store into darkness. Her pulse raced as she fumbled for her phone, switching on its flashlight. In the weak beam of light, she saw something glinting on the floor. She leaned down, squinting, and her stomach turned when she realized what it was. An old, rusty name tag, reading Jim. Footsteps echoed softly behind her, and she spun around, shining her light into the aisles. She saw a shadow dart between shelves, the faintest outline of a figure slipping just out of sight. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely a whisper. The silence answered her, stretching on, thick and unbroken. Then she heard it, a soft, raspy voice, almost like a whisper. "Sarah." Her heart stopped. She hadn't told anyone her name. She backed toward the door, keeping her light aimed ahead of her, but then her foot caught on something, a pile of what looked like uniforms scattered on the floor. She pointed her flashlight down and nearly screamed. The uniforms were all stained, torn, and each one had a name tag. Jim, Tim, David, Lucy. All of them, dusty and crumpled, lying in a forgotten pile. The voice came again, closer this time, a low whisper that crawled through the dark. "Sarah." She bolted for the door, her fingers scrabbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, panic flooding her as the doorknob seemed to resist her every attempt. Then she felt it. A presence right behind her, close enough to feel a cold breath on her neck. She dared a quick glance over her shoulder and saw a figure looming in the darkness, his face twisted in that same unnatural grin she'd glimpsed before. "Why leave so soon?" he whispered, his voice filled with a strange, mocking tone. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and dark, and his grin stretched far too wide, as if his mouth were pulled back by invisible strings. She yanked the door handle with every ounce of strength she had. Just as she thought she'd be trapped forever, the door burst open, and she stumbled out into the night. She sprinted to her car, fumbling with her keys, heart racing as she glanced back at the store. The man was standing in the doorway, staring at her with that same twisted grin, his eyes following her every move. He raised a hand and waved slowly, almost mockingly, as she jammed her keys into the ignition and started the engine. Peeling out of the lot, she glanced in her rearview mirror, expecting to see the gas station recede into the darkness. But what she saw made her blood run cold. The entire station was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, as if no gas station had ever been there. Terrified, she sped down the highway, her hands trembling on the wheel. When she finally reached the next town, she stopped at a diner and stumbled inside, her mind still reeling. She told the waitress what had happened, expecting disbelief. But the waitress's face grew pale, her eyes wide with horror. "That old gas station? It burned down over 20 years ago. The owner, Jim, he died in the fire. Some say his spirit haunts that stretch of road, that he calls out to travelers by name, trying to lure them inside." Sat in stunned silence, her body numb, her mind racing with disbelief and terror. She knew she had been there. She'd felt the cold air, heard the whispers, seen the twisted grin of the man who'd called her by name. She never drove that route again, but sometimes when she was alone at night, she'd hear that faint, raspy voice echoing in her mind, whispering her name in the darkness. "Sarah." Emma was driving through a stretch of road she didn't recognize, a detour forced upon her by endless construction and poor directions from her GPS. It was past midnight, and her gas gauge was blinking red. The road was deserted, the only lights coming from her headlights slicing through the dark woods surrounding her. Finally, she spotted a gas station up ahead, illuminated by a dim greenish glow. The place looked ancient. It had one pump, old and rusted, and a tiny convenience store with a cracked neon sign that read, "Open," in flickering letters. There were no other cars around. Emma didn't like the look of it, but she was running on fumes, and her options were non-existent. She pulled up to the pump, feeling a chill run through her as she stepped out into the cold night air. The silence was unnerving. Not even the chirp of crickets or the rustle of trees. It was as if everything around her had fallen completely still. She grabbed the pump and started to fill her tank, her eyes flicking back and forth over the empty lot, feeling that creeping sense of being watched. As the gas flowed, she looked toward the store and saw someone standing just inside the doorway. He was an old man, tall and thin, with deeply sunken eyes that seemed to glimmer in the shadows. He wore an old-fashioned gas station uniform, his clothes faded and frayed. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched her, his mouth fixed in a strange, tight line, his eyes unblinking. Emma felt a prickling at the back of her neck, but she forced herself to look away, telling herself he was probably just a bored attendant. She tried to shake the feeling, but her hands were trembling as she finished pumping her gas. She pulled her card out and headed inside, trying to calm her nerves. As she opened the door, a bell jingled weakly, the sound echoing strangely in the empty store. The inside was worse than the outside. Shelves of dust-covered products, cans with faded labels, expired snack foods, and a pervasive smell of damp, like mold festering behind the walls. The old man was now behind the counter, waiting with that same unnervingly still gaze. "Just the gas, please," she said, trying to sound casual, but her voice came out thin. The man didn't respond. He stared at her, his eyes dark and hollow, as if peering right through her. She felt like he was seeing something beyond her skin, something hidden deep inside. She shifted uncomfortably, her heart pounding. "Do you need my card?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Finally, he moved, his hand reaching out slowly to take the card. His fingers were pale and thin, almost skeletal, his nails yellowed and cracked. As he swiped her card, she noticed a faint mark on his wrist, a scar that looked like it had been burned into his skin. It was the shape of a small, perfect circle, like the end of a cigarette pressed deep into his flesh. She felt a wave of nausea but forced herself to stay calm. She'd pay, thank him, and leave as quickly as possible. But when he handed her the receipt, he spoke, his voice barely a rasp. "You're on the wrong road, you know." Emma blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" He smiled, a slow, chilling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't your road. It doesn't belong to you." Emma forced a nervous laugh, hoping he was just making some kind of creepy joke. "Well, I'm just passing through." He held her gaze, his smile fading. "You shouldn't be here. You should turn back before it's too late." Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt the urge to run, to get back in her car and drive until this place was a distant memory. She nodded quickly, thanked him, and turned to leave. As she was about to step out the door, he called to her in that same raspy voice. "Wait." She froze, turning back reluctantly. "Be careful," he said, his eyes intense and piercing. "Sometimes they don't let you leave." She didn't ask who they were. She didn't want to know. Without another word, she rushed back to her car, jumped in, and turned the key. Her heart pounded as she pulled out of the lot, glancing back only once to see him still standing there in the doorway, watching her leave with that same hollow stare. As she drove back onto the main road, her GPS recalculated and directed her onto a narrow, unfamiliar road that seemed to wind deeper into the woods. She was just about to pull over and check the map herself when she spotted something in the rearview mirror. The gas station lights were still visible, glowing dimly in the distance. But she'd been driving for at least 10 minutes. There was no way she should still be able to see it. She glanced back at the road, her pulse racing, and then looked again. The gas station was closer now, as if she hadn't moved at all. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly as panic set in. She hit the gas, accelerating down the winding road, desperate to put as much distance as possible between her and that place. But no matter how far she drove, when she looked back, the gas station was still there, closer and closer with each glance. A sinking feeling settled in her chest, and she thought of the old man's words. "This isn't your road. It doesn't belong to you." Her headlights began to flicker, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the trees around her. The road stretched on forever, the dark woods closing in, the gas station always lingering just behind her. The glow from its flickering sign was like a pair of watching eyes following her every move. Then her car stuttered, the engine sputtering as the headlights dimmed. She pressed her foot harder on the gas, but the car coasted to a slow stop. Heart pounding, she twisted the key, but the engine only clicked, refusing to start. In the silence, she heard something, a faint jingling sound like the bell on the gas station door. Her blood ran cold. She looked in the rearview mirror and saw a figure approaching, his outline illuminated by the eerie green glow of the gas station. The old man walked slowly, his twisted smile visible even from a distance. He lifted his hand, waving her forward. "You're on the wrong road." His voice echoed in her mind, as if he were whispering right beside her. She tried to open her door, but it wouldn't budge. She fumbled with her phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. She could only watch as he came closer, his eyes dark and empty, his expression twisted into a cold, knowing smile. The last thing she saw was his face, leaning in close to her window, his eyes gleaming with something she couldn't understand. He tapped on the glass, his mouth forming silent words. "Welcome to the end of the road." Mark had been driving for hours through an endless stretch of rural highway, with no cell signal and only static on the radio. He'd planned on making it to the next town before midnight, but his gas gauge was creeping closer to empty, and there were no signs of civilization in sight. His eyes grew heavy, and just as he was considering pulling over to sleep in his car, a gas station appeared at the side of the road, its flickering lights casting a pale glow over the cracked asphalt. Relieved, he pulled in, parking by the single weathered pump. The place looked ancient, as if it had been abandoned decades ago. The windows of the convenience store were covered in dust, and the door hung slightly open, swaying gently in the breeze. The only sound was the faint creak of a loose sign swinging above, displaying the name Smiley's Gas and Goods. But the letters on the sign looked scratched and faded, as if something had tried to claw them off. He grabbed his wallet and stepped out of the car, feeling an unsettling chill despite the warm night. He picked up the pump nozzle, but when he pressed the trigger, nothing happened. Frustrated, he looked toward the convenience store and saw a faint light inside. Figuring he'd have to pay first, he headed toward the store. As he reached the door, it creaked open wider, revealing a narrow, cluttered space. The shelves were covered with dust, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. There was a bell above the door, but it made no sound when he stepped inside. The dim light above flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice echoing faintly. For a moment, there was silence. Then from the back of the store, he heard a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps on a dirt floor. He strained his eyes, trying to see further into the dimly lit store. Finally, a figure appeared from the shadows. An older man with gray, stringy hair and sunken eyes stepped forward, wearing a stained uniform with a name tag that read Ed. He had a strange, fixed smile on his face, but his eyes were cold and unblinking. "Need gas?" the man asked in a raspy voice, barely above a whisper. "Yeah, pump's not working," Mark replied, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling twisting in his gut. The man nodded slowly. "Gotta turn it on from back here. Cash only, though." Mark pulled out a few bills, handing them over with a forced smile. The man's fingers brushed his, and they were ice cold, like touching something that had been buried in the ground. Ed took the money without breaking eye contact, his smile never faltering. "I'll get it running," Ed said, still holding onto the money, his gaze fixed intently on Mark. "You're the first one here in a while? Not many people come by this way." Mark nodded awkwardly, glancing back toward his car, suddenly desperate to leave. But he needed gas, and there wasn't any other option. He watched as Ed shuffled over to a rusty old lever at the back of the counter, pulling it down with a loud clang. "Pump's ready," Ed rasped, his smile widening. Mark muttered a quick thanks and hurried back to his car, grateful to be out of the man's unsettling gaze. He grabbed the nozzle, relieved to see the pump come to life, the numbers on the screen slowly ticking up as the gas flowed. But just as he was about to put the nozzle back, he caught movement in his peripheral vision. In the dusty window of the store, he saw Ed watching him, standing perfectly still with that same unnaturally wide grin. Mark's heart pounded as he looked away, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes boring into him. As he twisted the gas cap back on, he noticed something odd. There were no sounds around him. No crickets, no wind, nothing. The night was dead silent, and it felt as if even the air had grown colder. He got back in the car, ready to leave, but as he turned the key, the engine sputtered, then died. He tried again, but it wouldn't start. Panic flared as he looked up and saw Ed still watching him from the window, his grin somehow even wider now, almost stretching to the edges of his face. Mark's phone was dead, and he felt a rising dread as he considered his options. Just as he was about to step out and ask Ed for help, He caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. There was a figure standing behind his car, barely visible in the shadows. It looked like a person, but their posture was wrong, bent at an unnatural angle, their limbs twisted and contorted. They were swaying slightly, their head cocked to the side, their eyes gleaming faintly in the darkness. Heart pounding, Mark whipped around, but there was no one there. The parking lot was empty, illuminated only by the dim, flickering light above. He looked back toward the store, hoping Ed hadn't noticed his panic. But Ed was gone. The window where he'd been standing was empty, the store's lights now off. Only the faint glow of his car's dashboard illuminated the deserted gas station. Mark tried the ignition again, praying for the car to start, but the engine was dead. Then he heard a sound, faint at first, but growing louder. A slow, dragging scrape coming from somewhere close. He froze, listening, the sound echoing in the silent night. The scraping was coming from beneath his car. His hands trembled as he glanced at the side mirror, and his heart nearly stopped. The figure he'd seen in the rearview mirror was now crouched on the ground, peering out from beneath the car, its eyes wide and fixed directly on him. Its mouth was stretched into an unnatural open grin, revealing rows of sharp, crooked teeth. He yanked the door handle, stumbling out of the car, but as he backed away, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Ed stand by the pump, his grin now a grotesque parody of a smile, his teeth sharp and glinting in the dim light. "Looks like you're stuck," Ed said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. Mark backed up, his hands shaking, his breath shallow. "I just need to get out of here," he stammered. Ed's face twisted, his smile stretching even wider, his eyes growing darker. "There's no getting out once you're here," he whispered. "You're on Smiley's Road now." Mark turned to run, but the ground seemed to shift beneath him. The gas station, the pump, Ed, they all faded into a dark, twisted landscape as if he'd stumbled into some nightmarish version of reality. The air grew thick, the stars above twisting and swirling, casting an unnatural, sickly glow over everything. The last thing he heard was Ed's voice, whispering in the darkness, growing fainter with each step he took. "Welcome to Smiley's. They all end up here, sooner or later." Mark ran, but he knew somehow that he'd never find his way back to the road. He was trapped in that twisted realm, with Ed's voice echoing in his mind and those dark, hungry eyes watching from every shadow. No one ever saw him again. Jake was a night shift driver, used to the long, lonely stretches of road with nothing but stars overhead and an old radio to keep him company. He'd been driving that route for years, but this night was different. He was nearly out of gas, and the nearest station was hours away, or so he thought. Just as he was considering pulling over to conserve fuel, he spotted a glowing sign up ahead. "Last chance gas." Relieved, he pulled off the road and into the dimly lit lot. The station was ancient, almost eerie, with faded red paint peeling off the walls and a single pump under a flickering light. The convenience store looked like it had been left untouched for decades, with a cracked window and a sign that barely clung to the door, reading "Open 24 hours." Jake felt a strange unease as he got out of his car. The place was deathly silent. No crickets, no hum of distant traffic, just the faint rustle of leaves in the cold night air. He grabbed the pump, but when he pressed the handle, nothing happened. He sighed and glanced at the store, hoping there was someone inside to turn the pump on. The door creaked as he stepped inside, and a bell rang out with a metallic jingle that seemed to echo for far too long. The place was dimly lit, shelves covered in dust, and everything looked like it had been sitting there for years. Rows of canned goods with faded labels, expired snacks, and grimy magazines lined the shelves. A single bulb buzzed and flickered above the counter, illuminating a small bell with a sign that read, "Ring for service." He tapped the bell, the clang echoing sharply in the empty store. Seconds passed, but no one appeared. Just as he was about to ring again, a shuffling sound echoed from the back, and a man slowly emerged from the shadows behind the counter. The man was gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and shadowed. He wore an old, stained uniform with a name tag that read Sam, and his mouth twisted into a strange, forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Late night?" the man asked in a low, gravelly voice. "Yeah, just need some gas," Jake replied, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. Sam nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "Cash only," he said, in a tone that made Jake shiver. "All right, Jake mumbled, reaching for his wallet. As he handed over the cash, he noticed something peculiar about Sam's hands. They were covered in scars, long, thin lines that crisscrossed over his knuckles and fingers. The skin looked rough and cracked, as if it had been burned repeatedly. Sam caught him staring and curled his fingers inward, hiding the scars. "Gas pump's on now," he muttered, his voice even lower than before. Jake nodded, muttering a quick thanks, and turned to leave. As he walked back to his car, he felt the distinct sensation of being watched. He glanced back and saw Sam standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on him with that same unsettling smile. Jake hurried to the pump, hoping to fill his tank and get out of there as quickly as possible. As the gas flowed, he noticed something strange on the ground near his feet. Scratches in the pavement, as if something sharp had dragged across the concrete over and over. They led in a twisting, winding path around the pump, disappearing into the shadows. A chill ran down his spine, but he forced himself to ignore it, telling himself it was just his imagination. He finished pumping, put the nozzle back, and slid into his car. Just as he started the engine, he caught a glimpse of Sam, still standing by the door, watching him with that same eerie smile. He put the car in drive, eager to leave the station behind. But as he pulled out onto the road, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. The scratches, the strange marks he'd seen by the pump, continued down the road, winding in strange looping patterns, disappearing into the darkness ahead. Frowning, he kept driving, his curiosity growing. The scratches seemed to lead the way, like a twisted breadcrumb trail guiding him deeper into the night. He tried to shake the feeling of unease, but the scratches only grew more frequent, covering the road like scars etched into the asphalt. He checked his phone, hoping to get directions, but there was no signal. The road grew narrower, the trees crowding closer, and the headlights barely illuminated the way forward. The scratches were everywhere now, crisscrossing the road in strange, almost ritualistic shapes. His car began to sputter, and his heart sank. He'd just filled up. There was no reason he should be running out of gas again. He glanced at the gauge, and his stomach dropped. The needle was back on empty, as if he'd never filled it at all. Suddenly, the car lurched, the engine sputtering as the headlights dimmed, and it rolled to a stop in the middle of the road. Jake tried the ignition, but it was useless. The car was dead. The silence was oppressive, heavy, as if the night itself were holding its breath. He was about to try his phone again when he heard a faint sound, a scraping noise like nails dragging across metal. It was coming from somewhere close, far too close. His blood ran cold as he scanned the dark, his eyes straining to see anything beyond the faint glow of the dashboard. Then he saw it, a shadowy figure at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the dim light. It stood perfectly still, but he could feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and the scraping noise grew louder, closer, as if it were dragging something along the ground. Jake's heart raced as he locked his doors, his hands shaking. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a familiar, haunting smile. It was Sam, but he looked different. His eyes were hollow, empty, and his mouth was stretched far too wide, almost as if it had been carved into his face. In one hand, he held something long and sharp, dragging it along the asphalt, leaving fresh scratches as he approached. "Out of gas?" Sam's voice was a harsh whisper, echoing in the silent night. Jake was frozen, his mind racing for an escape. But before he could react, he felt a sharp, cold grip on his shoulder. He whipped around, and there, staring at him through the window, was another face, twisted, gaunt, and grinning that same unnatural smile. He was surrounded. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His vision blurred, his heartbeat thundered in his ears, and the last thing he saw was that endless, hollow smile, stretching wider and wider, as if it would swallow him whole. When a passing truck found Jake's car the next morning, it was empty, the doors still locked, the engine dead. But on the ground around it, there were scratches, long, looping marks that stretched down the road, leading back to the gas station. And in the dust on the windshield, there was a single word, scrawled in jagged letters: smile. Sarah was driving through the empty back roads of her small hometown, a shortcut she'd taken countless times. But tonight, it felt different. The road was darker than usual, the trees on either side casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward her car. She glanced at her gas gauge and frowned. It was lower than she thought. She'd forgotten to fill up after work and wasn't sure she'd make it home without a stop. Just as she was considering turning back, she saw a gas station up ahead, illuminated by a dim, yellowish glow. It wasn't one she recognized, but she figured it was new or one of those places she'd just never noticed before. Relieved, she pulled in, noting the old-fashioned pumps and the peeling paint on the sign that read, "Rest Stop Gas." The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, and no other cars were in sight. She got out, shivering slightly as the cool night air hit her. She picked up the nozzle, and as she waited for the gas to flow, she noticed a strange smell, sharp and metallic, like rusted metal mixed with old earth. She looked toward the store, hoping someone inside could help her, but the windows were dark. Then she saw something, a faint light flickering at the far end of the convenience store. A figure stood there, almost blending into the shadows. She couldn't see his face, but his outline was enough to make her uneasy. Deciding she'd just pay quickly and get out, she walked to the store, the door creaking loudly as she entered. The bell above the door gave a feeble ring, echoing through the empty space. Inside, the shelves were lined with dusty products, most of which looked they hadn't been touched in years. Expired snack foods, drinks in dusty bottles, and even old newspapers lay scattered on the counter. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding too loud in the stillness. She felt a chill run down her spine as she waited for an answer. Footsteps echoed from the back, slow and heavy, as if someone were dragging their feet. A man stepped out from the shadows behind the counter. He was tall, with gray hair and skin that looked almost waxy. His eyes were dark, almost black, and he didn't blink as he looked at her. "Just the gas," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curled into a slight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Cash only," he said in a low, almost gravelly tone. She dug through her purse and handed him a few bills, eager to leave as soon as possible. But when he took the money, his fingers brushed against hers, and she felt a strange, icy chill spread through her hand. She pulled her hand back, trying not to shudder. He didn't move, just stared at her with that same unsettling smile, as if he knew something she didn't. "Late night for a drive," he murmured. Sarah forced a smile. "Yeah, just trying to get home." The man nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Be careful out there. You might find things aren't as they seem." The way he said it made her stomach turn, and she gave a quick nod, mumbling a thanks before heading back to her car. As she walked back, she felt the weight of his stare on her, his eyes following her every step. Back in her car, she tried to shake the feeling, telling herself he was just an odd guy working a late shift. But as she looked in her rearview mirror, she saw something strange. A figure, barely visible in the dark, standing by the gas pump, staring at her car. She shivered and put the car in drive, glancing in the mirror as she pulled out. The figure was still there, watching her with those dark, empty eyes, a hint of that eerie smile on his face. As she drove down the dark road, her anxiety grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trees around her looked different, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes, almost like clawed hands reaching toward her. The road seemed darker, the night heavier, as if the darkness was closing in. Suddenly her car's headlights flickered, and the radio crackled to life, playing a faint, static-filled tune that sounded like an old lullaby. The song was familiar, something she remembered from her childhood, but distorted, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. Her heart raced as she tried to turn the radio off, but the knob wouldn't budge. She gripped the steering wheel, her hands shaking, glancing at the road ahead, and then she saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes, her car screeching to a halt just inches from the figure. Her headlights illuminated him, a tall man with gray hair and a waxy face, his eyes dark and hollow. It was the man from the gas station. She blinked, her heart pounding in her chest, but he was gone. The road was empty, the darkness swallowing the spot where he'd stood. Shaken, she took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. She'd imagined it, she told herself. Just nerves and a creepy encounter getting to her. She gripped the wheel and started driving again, faster this time, eager to get home. But as she continued, she noticed something horrifying. The road was leading her back toward the gas station. Her heart sank as she saw the dim glow of the sign in the distance. She'd driven in a straight line, hadn't made any turns, but here she was, right back where she'd started. She pulled over, breathing heavily. her mind racing. Her car's radio crackled again, and that same lullaby played, faint but unmistakable. She tried her phone, desperate for some connection, but there was no signal. A shadow passed over her car, and she looked up to see the man standing just outside her window, his face inches from the glass. He didn't move, just stared at her with that empty, chilling gaze. His mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear. Terrified, she threw the car in reverse, flooring it down the road. She didn't care where she was going. She just needed to get away. But no matter how far she drove, she couldn't escape. Every turn led her back to that gas station, its dim lights glowing like a beacon in the dark. The man was always there, waiting, watching her with that unnerving smile. And then, as her car ran out of gas, it stopped right in front of the store, the headlights casting a dim light over the parking lot. The man stepped forward, his smile widening as he walked toward her car, his hollow eyes never leaving hers. "Welcome back," he whispered, his voice echoing in her mind. "You'll be here for a long, long time." Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was his face, inches from hers, that empty gaze pulling her into darkness. The next morning, a passing driver spotted her abandoned car outside the gas station. The lot was empty, the store dark and silent. Inside the car, the driver found only one clue, a dusty old receipt from Rest Stop Gas dated 20 years earlier. And on the back, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Some roads lead nowhere." Alex was returning from a late-night shift at the warehouse. His route took him down Old Highway 89, a road he normally avoided at night. The highway was infamous among locals, known for strange tales and unsettling encounters. But Alex was tired and eager to get home, so he decided to take the shortcut. The drive was quiet, the only sound the hum of his engine as his car cut through the darkness. He kept one eye on the fuel gauge, which was dangerously close to empty. Just as he was wondering how far he'd have to go before finding a gas station, a sign appeared on the side of the road. 88 miles gas, with an arrow pointing right. He didn't remember a gas station ever being on this stretch of highway, but he chalked it up to bad memory. Grateful for the find, he turned down the narrow side road that led to it. The gas station came into view at the end of the road, looking eerily isolated. The lot was dimly lit, the neon sign flickering weakly. The place looked almost frozen in time, rusty pumps, faded advertisements for long-gone products, and cracked windows on the convenience store. He was the only one there. Alex pulled up to the pump, stepped out, and tried the nozzle, but the pump wouldn't start. Sighing, he looked around for any sign of an attendant. The lights inside the store were dim, but he could make out a figure behind the counter. He entered the convenience store, the smell of old dust and mildew hanging heavily in the air. The shelves were filled with outdated products, most of them coated in a fine layer of dust. An old radio sat on the counter, quietly playing a distorted tune that sounded like an old country ballad. The man behind the counter looked up, his eyes cloudy and unfocused. His skin was pale, almost grayish, and he wore a name tag that read Joe. There was something unsettling about him, a stillness as if he hadn't moved in hours. "Need some gas?" Alex said, trying to keep his tone casual. Joe didn't respond at first. He just stared, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Pump's ready," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. Alex thanked him and headed back to the pump, but as he approached, he noticed something strange on the ground. There were dark stains leading from the pump into the woods behind the station, almost like old, dried blood. He shuddered but shook it off as paranoia and began filling up his tank. As he waited, he heard something faint coming from the trees, a strange whispering, barely audible, as if someone or something were lurking just out of sight. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he turned, scanning the tree line. Shadows seemed to move between the trees, shifting in a way that didn't match the light from the gas station. The pump clicked, signaling that his tank was full. He replaced the nozzle and got back into his car, eager to leave. But when he looked back at the store, Joe was standing in the doorway, watching him with that same unsettling smile. Alex pulled out of the station, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, watching as Joe's figure grew smaller in the distance. But as he turned back to face the road, his stomach dropped. Another figure stood just up ahead, directly in his path. He slammed on the brakes, and his car skidded to a halt. The figure stepped into the light, and Alex's breath caught in his throat. It was Joe, Somehow, impossibly, Joe stood on the road in front of him, the same strange smile on his face. There was no way he could have gotten there before Alex. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was no explanation. Heart pounding, he swerved around the figure and sped off, not daring to look back. As he drove, the air grew colder and the trees seemed to close in around him. He glanced at his fuel gauge, hoping he had enough to make it back to the main road. But to his horror, the needle was back on empty. He had just filled up. There was no reason it should be this low. The radio in his car crackled to life, and that same distorted tune played, echoing in the confined space of the car. His headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees around him. And then he saw it again, the faint outline of a gas station up ahead. It was the same station, the same cracked windows, the same neon sign flickering in the darkness. He'd somehow circled back. No. Alex muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He had no choice but to pull in, his car sputtering as it rolled to a stop. He sat there, heart pounding, debating whether to go back inside. But then he saw Joe, standing by the pump, watching him with that familiar, unnatural smile. Summoning his courage, Alex stepped out of the car. He approached Joe cautiously, every instinct telling him to run. "You're back," Joe said softly, his voice carrying a chilling echo. "Guess you're here to stay, then." Alex swallowed hard. "No, I just need enough gas to get to town." Joe tilted his head, his smile widening. "There is no town, son, not from here, only one road, and it leads right back to us." Alex took a step back, his pulse racing. "This is some kind of joke, right?" Joe shook his head slowly. "Once you're on this road, you can't leave. It's not your road anymore. It's ours." His voice was almost a whisper, but the words filled Alex with an overwhelming sense of dread. He bolted to his car, slamming the door shut and turning the key. The engine roared to life, and he floored it, speeding down the road as fast as he could. But as he drove, he began to notice something horrifying. The gas gauge wasn't going up, it was dropping lower faster than it should. He'd barely driven a mile, and already the needle was at the red mark. Panic set in as he kept driving, desperate to escape. But no matter how far he went, the same flickering lights of the gas station appeared up ahead, drawing him back, like some twisted loop. He couldn't escape. He passed the station again and again, each time more frantic than the last. And each time, Joe was there, standing by the pump, that same eerie smile plastered on his face. Finally, as the car began to sputter one last time, Alex's headlights flickered out, leaving him in total darkness. The car coasted to a stop, and he was left in silence, save for the faint echo of that haunting, distorted song playing in his head. As he sat there, paralyzed by fear, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. They were slow, deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as he felt a cold hand rest on his shoulder. A voice, barely a whisper, echoed in his ear. "Welcome to the road that never ends." When a local driver passed by the next morning, they saw a car parked by the pump, empty and abandoned, its doors left open. The convenience store was dark, the neon sign flickering weakly. There was no one in sight, no sign of anyone having been there, except for a single note left on the dashboard of the car, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "This road is a trap. Don't ever stop."